Thank you, Ralph Techtmeier, better known as Frate UD, to speak with me on behalf of Espelho de Circe, this Brazilian initiative down here, and giving an interview. But well, I sent you the a couple of pages of topics, so I was thinking that we could have more of a talk than an interview as such. Okay.
Fine. Yeah.
So it's how it feels looking back, Ralph. So many decades in magic and contributed so much to modern Western magic. What is your impressions and feelings today, looking back?
Actually, I never look back because it's an ongoing process. And yes, it started many decades ago, more than I like to count. Well, actually, exactly 6 decades ago, end of this year. But yeah, I never looked back because once I'd found that, I mean, I tried out a whole hell of a lot of other things before. And once I struck magic, it stuck. And I think it's Castaneda who has his Don Juan say at one point, why are you doing all this? And he says, because there's no other way to live.
Ah.
And I think that's not that I like Castaneda particularly, but I think that's a pretty good answer.
Absolutely, and yeah, because I agree with you. This question of why are you doing magic, I think is kind of important, and most people get a bit confused when this question is posed.
Well, that's because most people get a bit confused when you ask them just about anything, why they're doing stuff in their life or what they're doing with their lives. And it's not surprising, really, because, you know, in Western culture at least, and actually in most Eastern cultures as well these days, magic is very much either no or it's an unknown, and it is, you know, loaded with all types of more or less negative associations. And it doesn't feature that well in fairy tales or mythology either. I mean, usually witches or magicians or sorcerers, whatever you want to call them, aren't actually the most amenable of people. You know, they're considered dangerous, they're considered crafty, wily. Yes, people do want their powers on their side, they want them to act in their favor, do things for them, but they're always, well, respected to some extent, feared, they're always, but hardly ever loved. And so opting for magic is really very much like opting out of society in general, at least with the mainstream, regarding the mainstream. And so it's quite a tough decision for many people, especially if, you know, more or less socially inclined. You know, you want to be liked and you want to like your friends and exchange things. And of course, in pursuing magic, you will have a lot of experiences you can't really talk about reasonably to anyone else who hasn't had at least a similar experience. And you know, it's just like try to explain how milk tastes to someone who's never tasted milk in his life. It's just impossible. Or what happens on an acid trip, or if you take ayahuasca or ecstasy or whatever it is. If you're amongst people who aren't familiar with the experience, you'll just sound like bonkers and an utter alien. And not everyone is prepared or willing to take that up. And hey, it's some of it can be quite nasty as well. It's not all roses and flowers and perfume. I mean, some experiences can be downright nasty, if not well, hazardous to your physical or mental health.
Exactly. No, I agree with you. It's we have this, of course, mysterious and silent and enigmatic part of magic, but you have a, at least in your books, is it's kind of sex, money, protection, and high magic.
High magic wasn't actually my term. It was the term used by the publishers.
Uh,
I mean, I don't object to that, because as a professional author and writer and translator, I know that it's always the publisher's prerogative to choose the title, because after all, they have to market this thing. And personally, I don't like the term high magic too much.
yeah.
I just prefer magic or even sorcery, because in my view, magic has always been a technique of survival. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's not all about sex and money, sex and drugs and rock and roll, as it were. But hey, if you look at the majority of magical practices worldwide and throughout history, it was always about something like that. It could be about healing and killing, and the oldest form of magic we know about is hunting magic. So what was that? That wasn't about inflating your ego or getting in contact with your highest self or soul. It was simply about material survival. I'm not dissing high magic. Don't get me wrong there, but I think that what many people understand and by the term high magic is actually more akin to mysticism than sorcery.
Yeah. No, I wanted to ask you about this as well, because as I told, this is kind of sex, money, drugs, protection, and then high magic, of course.
Yeah,
It's in
I,
how,
I
yeah.
I got the irony. Yeah.
So, but yeah, no, I agree with you. And even if in high magic as well, is all not always that the goals are as serene and pure and celestial as people want them to be either. So this high, low, black, white. What do you think about these graduations, like low magic, high magic? I agree with you that it just describes different forms of practice of magical engagements. But you think it is still useful to use
Not
terms like
really.
this? No.
Not really. I mean, there's an old joke in the magical community. Black magic is always the other guy's magic.
Oh yeah.
So, what does that really entail? I mean, yeah. I mean, look, I don't mind high magic, and I don't mind the mysticist approach for people who feel comfortable with it. Go ahead. But again, I mean, it's like one man's meat is another's poison. I mean, for example, if you want to protect yourself or your family, your loved ones from someone, and you've got to, let's say, take up drastic measures by any normal, well, let's say common standard, that might be an act of black magic. I mean, look at Aleister Crowley, who said that any act that's not supposed to reunite you with Godhead is an act of black magic. I mean, I don't think that's a magician's definition. That's a mystic's definition, which
Mhm.
is okay by itself. But don't confuse it with other stuff. So I don't really think that it's a very useful term, and it actually hails back to especially 19th century sensibilities and earlier. There's a lot of monotheist, especially Christian bias included in that, and this whole thing about the body and the soul and the mind, and you've got to take care of your soul as well as your body, because there's an afterlife and you might be punished if you don't. All that is included in these dichotomies of high and low magic or black and white magic.
Mhm.
I will agree that there is magic that is at least intended to be destructive. Okay,
Mhm.
you may call that black magic if you want, but again, the destruction depends on the circumstances, on the context. Self-defense may be pretty destructive in the end, but personally, by my personal ethics, it would still be okay if there's no other way. So. Uh, and hardly anyone. Well, there's a few people around, yeah, but hardly anyone in general is really destructive for destruction's sake.
Hmm.
They usually have some agenda. They have some wishes, or they may be misguided in that by whatever standards you apply. But even Satanists wouldn't go around not seriously and claim that they are all about evil.
No.
Uh, Hey, even the Nazis didn't do that. I mean, even they claimed to have the good on their side. I mean, and look what it brought us.
Yes. Yeah, but it's really interesting, these matters with love and high, and yeah. So you have to defend yourself. You want to, let's say you are in a difficult position. You're hungry. You're going out for food. You enter in all these problematic areas concerning moral and ethics, and we can even question magic and ethics, what they have in common. Should it be any kind of magical ethics in terms of using magic to make your life better?
Well, it's about, might just as well ask guns and ethics. What do they have in common?
Yeah.
Nothing and everything depends on who you ask.
Exactly.
I mean, personally, I think ethics are a very personal thing, and
Hmm.
uh, nothing should tell you about. I can tell you what my ethics are, but I cannot really reasonably tell you what your ethics should be. I mean, sure, I can say that, but hey, where does that get us? I mean, either you agree or you don't, and if you don't, well, then we part as what, enemies, or agreeing to disagree, or whatever. But it's an eminently personal thing, just like religion is.
Hmm.
For me, magic was always really a technical matter. Really, it's more an engineering question than an ethical one.
Mm. Uh, yes, and I think this is interesting because I of course share the similar perspective as you. There is this engineering, the more technical part of magic, and then we have how the world has changed over the decades. For instance, taking what we spoke about now, ethics and opinions. Uh, in the past, maybe it's age speaking, looking to the more the adolescent times and so on. But at least like 30 years ago, I think we were more attuned to see differences of opinion, differences of ethics, difference of everything as a way of growth, expanding our horizon to
Mhm.
wow, your experience, your perspective is enriching our common interest.
Well, yeah, that's a question of well, what in German is called discussion culture,
Mm.
and or even conflict culture, and uh, yeah, I think things have changed in that. Let's say 30 years ago. I mean, okay, they were quite violent, even discussions, and cancel culture isn't exactly an invention of our times, but. Um, there were times when it was actually more common, to have discussions on a mutual respect basis,
Hmm.
and yes, if push comes to shove, to agree to disagree. And I think that's the way it really should be. I mean, it's what the ancient Greeks did already, and but even there, I mean, you did have some fairly unsavory developments there. I mean, look at Socrates, who they forced to suicide, and stuff like that. But and it was quite a violent world in its own right at that time, and it still is. But these days, yes, I think discussion culture could really do with a certain upgrade, and even a return to some call them maybe old-fashioned modes of respect and of I mean, mutual and reciprocal respect, and the ability to actually live with the fact that not everyone is of your own opinion.
Hmm. Yeah, because at least when you and Pete and Ray was founding the IoT decades ago, I
Yep.
remember it was such a breath of fresh air because of matters like this. Is the call to responsibility, the call to making magic happen. You are magic, the paradigms and crashing everything, but in a very methodic, orderly, and good way. It's almost like for me at the time, IoT represented a very a big conscient magical force that grew up from punk, from social awareness, from wanting more. From it was something that took the pulse of time so much on his veins that I have no problems seeing why the Chaos Magic IT impacted modern magic in the way it did. But back in those days, was it my sentiments harmonizes with yours in for the time?
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, the IoT in its original form, where it was more or less virtual, and then its more formalized form, which I was part of in founding the Magical Pact of the Illuminates of Thanateros, was very much a child of its own times, and you pointed it out already. I mean, there was a lot of punk culture involved. There was a lot of contrarianism, anti-authoritarianism. There was a lot of iconoclasm included in that. Why? Because and actually we weren't the only ones. I'll give you another example. For example, Michael Harner, when he promoted his specific version of shamanism, and I know him fairly well. I worked as an interpreter for half a dozen of his seminars in Switzerland, and what did he do? He actually tried to reduce shamanism to its perceived basics. You may not always agree about with him, this, that, and the other, and especially his commercialization of the same. That's another story altogether. But what he said was, let's get rid of all that cultural ballast, as it were, that has stuck to shamanism across the world, and let's get down to the basic techniques. Again, it was an engineer's approach, really, rather than a philosopher's or a religious approach. And that is exactly what the IoT was all about as well. Taking the magical tradition and getting rid of everything that was, in our opinion at least, or in our view and in our practical experience, that was superfluous, that was culturally biased, that was basically just frills and bells and whistles, which would usually, more often than not, actually divert you from what everything was about in the technical sense. And hence this chaos magical reductionism, as it were. And yes, I mean, there was structuralism around at that time, and of course there's still very much a sensibility of post-hippie culture around, and as I said, iconoclasm and contrarian views this was about, let's not just stick to any old stuff simply because some authority has claimed this to be the absolute truth. In fact, in the pact, for instance, when you were initiated into the third degree, there was only one question you had to answer. Are you aware that there may not be absolute truths?
Hmm.
It doesn't say that there aren't absolute truths. It's just that there may not be.
Yeah.
And anyone who could not answer that in the affirmative would not actually be initiated. But that was all you had to bring along.
I see.
And
Beautiful, really.
yes, I
Understandable.
think I think it's a brilliant approach, and So other well, you've mentioned that when we discussed this podcast initially. Yes, I'm a member of the Fraternitas Saturni. That's an entirely different paradigm. Yeah, I mean there's a whole lot. I mean it is very, very undogmatic, even if you don't actually can't really discern this from the literature around.
Hmm.
But I mean, because it's telemic and all that. But yes, it's a different approach. There's a whole lot of other questions you have to answer there, and it's not that simple and certainly not that reductionist. But that was actually the novelty of the IoT, and the reason why it hit off in a big way in terms of general culture, starting with fashion, through music and a lot of other areas, action art and what have you, was precisely that, because it actually managed to co-opt the spirit of the times, as it were. And it wasn't just the younger generation. I mean, both Peter Carroll and I weren't actually exactly spring chickens when we brought this about, and the people who joined the pact, or the IoT at the time. There's a wide range, from people who were just some like 18 years old to people who were over 80,
Yeah.
and they got along fine, more or less, most of the time, and especially on the working basis, it was absolutely no problem to get all these people, to develop and conduct rituals or magical workings of whatever kind, and discuss them in a productive manner, because we were not limited by any dogmatics. We were not limited by having to adhere to some absolute truth, uh, where you'd be really in very deep water if you didn't agree to it.
Hmm.
That initially, at least, didn't happen.
Yeah, and this personally, as I told you, I never went to this direction of IoT, the pact. But I worked with Topi in the last dying year of Topi before Jen decided that he was getting too much of a guru, so he closing down. But still working within this chaos structure, this Topi network after, and I have to say it's a similar thinking, the non-dogmatic. You have to be prepared that it's all a lie, that your truth might not be a truth, and uh, even today, so many years after, I think uh, this mindset is still very healthy for whatever I'm doing, because I'm keeping my mind critical. It's always this kind of skeptical voice present everywhere. That when I see dogma, is I always have a little red alert going on somewhere, and is very fond of the word why.
Absolutely. So same here, and I think it's a mindset. Once you've developed it, you can't really very well get rid of it again, and neither should you.
Hmm.
But of course, that doesn't mean that let's say your kids or their kids in turn will inherit it necessarily. You can live by example. You can voice yourself and teach and write books and do podcasts about it all the time. But yeah, generations will change. They will, prioritize different things. And for example, in our times, it was a lot about it was about the sexual revolution. I don't see a lot of that going on these days. There's a gender revolution. That's another story.
Hmm.
But
True.
but it isn't about fuck who you like and as often as you like, and certainly not anymore. And well, okay, that's every generation's own privilege to set its own priorities.
Hmm.
I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, but it's certainly different. And for example, these days in the magical scene, you see a lot of revival of grimoire magic.
Yes.
that would have been more or less unthinkable, say 40 or 30 years ago, because grimoire magic was considered to be very, very dogmatic and Christianized and biased this, that, with it, that way and the other. Now, there's a lot of very, very good research going on, questioning these tenets in turn. And so, yeah, for us, grimoires were more about techniques rather than say a Weltanschauung or a religious dogmatic foundation. And to many grimoire magicians today, it may be the same thing, but it's not quite the same kind of critical spirit. It's a different kind of critical spirit that's at work there, at least in the more serious, let's say, scholars on the subject. But yeah, it's another priority. I'm not saying this is the end all and be all of modern magic, but it is a very strong current now, and a current that was more or less, well, not really unthinkable at let's say 30 years ago, but it was certainly very much a minority thing, usually considered to be, old-fashioned, authoritarian, and something which, as a chaos magician, you had to question.
Hmm.
But hey, today there's quite a few chaos magicians who seriously investigate grimoire magic, and I'm totally fine with that. It's not my approach, but hey, a lot of stuff in magic has never been my approach, and probably it will never be.
Yeah. Uh, when you see the how chaos magic is done today, how is understood in our culture, is it surprising for you to see that it developed into this direction? You still think it has an energy that is fresh on the point, still taking out this vibration of the punk to crush and find the essence to kind of save the meat and discard the gravy in a way, as it was in the past, or it
No, I
changed
don't think
very
so.
much. Yeah.
I don't think so. The way I view current day chaos magic, in as much as I am savvy on it, because I'm not really involved in the scene in any serious manner anymore. But what I can see and what I read and find out about social media or via social media and so on, I think it has percolated into general culture to some extent, but even to the extent that it's hardly discernible anymore.
Hmm.
I mean, when I did my review on paralibrum.com on Gary Lackman's Dark Star Rising, Magic and Power in the Age of Trump,
Ah,
I did take a bit. It's a very, very good book, and I highly recommend it, even after Trump now, or
yeah.
pre-Trump again. Who's
Yeah.
to say?
Let's see it.
Uh, it's an excellent book, and I highly recommend it to everyone. But his take on chaos magic is, in my view, rather limited and simplistic. But that's probably not really his fault, because that is what chaos magic has turned out to become these days.
Mhm.
Even to the extent of being, co-opted by some very, very right-wing, especially Russian guys who take part in it, and or claim it for themselves, and some others. But no, I think it. But that's actually not surprising. I mean, look at the French Revolution. I mean, from Robespierre to Napoleon.
Mhm.
What a sad development, you might
Yes.
say. You might say. And I was never a fan of Napoleon's, I must say.
Yeah. Me
Robespierre,
and you
so
both.
so. But I love me my guillotine, but that's another story.
Yes.
Uh, um, so it's always like that when a new kind of zeitgeist develops, and a new kind of, well, call it an ideology for practical purposes, comes around, or a new way of thought. after a while it loses its novelty features. And it's,
Mm.
it's not as shocking anymore because more people have adopted it. Quite few people, maybe a lot of whom shouldn't have
Mhm.
co-opted it. They've commercialized it or watered it down. And of course, these days, yes, you will still find some people who are all about being critical, who are all about questioning just about everything. But it's what my daughters told me once, that it's actually hard to rebel against me
Mm.
because I'd been doing the rebelling against the previous generation before them already,
Yes.
and to the extent that sometimes they had the feeling that there was nothing left for them. So maybe I wasn't authoritarian or dogmatic enough or whatever. But okay, they're doing fine, and that is a generational thing, really. I mean, one generation's revolution is the next generation's reactionary state of affairs.
Yes. No, I totally second what you are saying. Is even for me, even if there are, I always have this desire to understand more than desire to judge. Of course, the judgment comes out here and there because when I say it was better back in the days, well, that's a judgment, but it is basically related to some preference of aesthetics, culture, and so forth, I think, and perhaps even a tad lack of interest for me to understand the modern zeitgeist, if you wish, because I still like it, the insistence on the books, on the word, on the series, that you had to know a lot in order to break what the dogma. Like I was 18, an idiot, speaking about paradigms here and this, and how I'm creating my own magic, my system, blah blah blah, until a guy beated me in the head with Thomas Kuhn's book about paradigms, and stop being an idiot. Read this so you know what you're speaking about. You're making a fool of
Yeah, of
yourself.
course. I think in magic, as in every other your human activity, it's always a very good idea to do your homework.
Yeah.
And doing your homework, yes, that may imply a lot of reading, quite a bit of boring reading, maybe even. I mean, Arthur Edward Waite, who loves to read that guy? Nobody. But but
Nobody.
but 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 uh, uh, but it's still important to know at least a bit about what he's written and why he had this impact on things, in spite of everyone making fun of him even in his lifetime. I mean, look at Aleister Crowley again, how he dealt with Arthur Edward Waite. I mean, it was hilarious.
Yes.
But yeah, you basically, it actually boils down to you should know what you're talking about, and simply taking up some slogans and tidbits you have culled from superficial reading or even social media. But it's not the social media alone that are at fault there. It's how you use them.
Mhm.
And uh, and then, of course, there's school education, which is quite another serious topic in its own right, and what it actually does to people or doesn't do to people, which should do to people and doesn't, and so on. So critical thinking. But hey, I think it was Rudolf Steiner who once said that there was a time when the ability of critical thinking was considered a magical craft.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure that time is over.
Okay.
Uh, Not that I'm a great fan of Steiner's again, but again, there is that, and of course, basically, I mean, but that isn't actually a new thing. I mean, look, for example, looking at history, be political or social history, economic history, or even the history of philosophy, religion. Uh, that was very much a minority thing 30 years ago, and it still is today. That hasn't really changed. There's always a mere minority of people who would actually go for that and get into it in some serious manner, so that they, as you said, wouldn't stay fools throwing around buzzwords like paradigms, for instance, but
Mhm.
that they'd actually know what that actually implies and how it works, and what to look out for, and what to avoid and things like that. And yes, I mean, it was a privilege maybe of our younger years too in Chaos Magic, that a lot of this reductionism conducted there, it promoted there, was in itself simplistic again. I
Mhm.
mean, I gave you one example with grimoires, for instance,
Yes.
and a lot of other stuff. And so reductionism isn't any good for its own sake. It has to have its functional merits. It should actually, that's what I'm about at least. It should actually improve what you're doing. Then, of course, it's fine. But don't be reductionist just for the heck of it.
Mhm.
Unless you know what you're doing.
Yes, uh, absolutely agree with you, because it's another thing as well in serial magic, for instance. You wrote the modern classic on practical serial magic, and back in
Thank
the
you.
days, it was a pen, and it was the artistic element, and it was the design,
Yep.
it was all these kind of things. And today we have so much cool and nice technology around, and this, what should we call it, tech magic. You How you see the, is it as effective as is it just a aging guy that is the pen is better than the keyboard, or is it something added magically in actually using practical tools to flesh things
Well,
out
in
versus.
in the German IoT, and I make that distinction, or the German-speaking IoT, which at that
uh,
time encompassed Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, we actually went for that very early on. The English didn't, for several reasons. One of them being that Peter Carroll was actually a technophobe, but that's a different story.
uh
We had communication via bulletin board systems. I mean, via computer very early on. We did initiations where people would be sitting in their gowns uh, in front of computer screens. We were thinking about using, subliminal sigils on a computer. We experimented with that kind of stuff, but that was considered an expansion, but not something that would be, would replace the old-fashioned pen and paper type of sigil magic, for instance. That was considered an expansion. Basically, uh, in a way, it was subversive, using computer technology. And at that time, I mean, having a PC was quite expensive, and they were slow like hell, and there was no Windows around, which maybe was an advantage, but never mind. And you had to have quite a bit of programming skills to actually fine tune your box and so on, and that was pre-internet, or at least popular internet. And so we were on BBSs, on FidoNet, and later on I joined up with CompuServe, and then came the internet, or the World Wide Web proper, and so on. Uh, and initially, basically, for example, this BBS communication was an all German thing. The Brits didn't go for it. They didn't want to spend the money on computers. They weren't convinced at all that all this IT would hold a future or whatever, and they didn't really see the
Okay,
advantages of it.
I
So.
see.
So here I was. I mean, hey, I hadn't written Liber Null and Psychonaut like Peter J. Carroll did, but here I was with, and of course at that time the German section of the IoT made for about 80% of the membership. So yeah, so I was a majority leader, as you might say, and we were into all this advanced, or you'd say avant-garde kind of technology stuff.
Uh,
But the major section, actually the place where all this came from, the IoT as an impulse, they were all standoffish and no and no and weren't participating in it. And
mm,
that may have changed later on, but not very much. Not until the breakup, and this was still very much a fight of analog and digital. But
I see.
to return to your initial
Uh,
question, if you think that Precision Magic, well, is the keyboard mightier than the pen? Like hell, it isn't.
mm,
But then the pen isn't mighty either. It's what you
no.
do with it. That's the whole point. I mean, there are sites where you can actually auto-generate sigils. Okay, fine. I use them for illustration's sake. For example, my next book, which will hopefully be out in English soon. Actually, it's a collaborative work with 3 other guys. They asked me for some suggestions for the cover illustrations,
Uh,
and yeah, I created some sigils via this one of these online sites which would do that, because those were not sigils I would actually want to charge and so on. It was simply convenience, and
I see.
but that was it. On the other hand, you might perhaps expand classical sigil magic by using these tools, and good luck if you do. Fine. That was all. I mean, for me, chaos magic was always a subset of what I had several years earlier termed pragmatic magic.
Mhm.
Pragmatic magic as opposed to dogmatic magic. Pragmatic magic has only one single dogma. If it works, use it.
Yes.
That's it. Everything else is open to discussion and experimentation and so on. And so chaos magic is a logical subset of that. But and that's been my approach ever since. So yeah, go for it. Go for all electronic and online and cloud stuff and what have you. If it works out, fine. But if it doesn't, hey, I'd suggest going back to the basics
Mhm.
and start rethinking your approach,
Yeah.
and maybe retaking it from there.
Yeah. Yeah, because you think it's a lot of what should we call it, dishonesty in terms of magical results out there. Because again, back in the days, it was this big scrutiny of verifying your result. You know, it's kind of so result oriented. If it didn't happen, so you did either wrong, you had to do it again.
Yes, and hey, even at those times, I mean, discerning results was, let's put it mildly, very much a subjective affair.
Mm,
Like you do a spell to win the lottery jackpot,
yes.
and then hey, you actually do win €3.20, or at that time it was German marks or pounds or dollars or whatever. Okay, so let's say you win $3. That's not exactly the jackpot. Now, is that a magical success or isn't it? And so people will say, well, if you wanted to win the jackpot and you didn't, it obviously wasn't a success. Yeah,
Yeah.
but something happened.
Yes, something happened.
It's synchronicities and their interpretation, and that apart, quite a few people in the old times weren't exactly, let's say, very honest about the results all the time either.
Mm,
Maybe certainly not towards others, and possibly not even to themselves.
yeah.
So it was always a big issue with magic, and it still is really.
Yes. No, because I always thought it maybe it's a consequence of having many years in university and having a more scientific
Yeah.
mindset and no fear of okay, you do a test and it failed, and okay, so you do again or you modify the test or whatever. So uh, it's what I see today in this in the modern spirit is so much desire to make things work in a way. It's a kind of very high energy society that we have created, isn't it? With the intensity is a bit different. And
Let's say
like,
the fetish of optimization.
yes.
And that, of course, impacts a lot of things, is the basis of a lot of Western societies' general, you might say, unreflected ideology.
Mm-hmm.
More and better, better and more, always, all the time, and so on. It impacts health, and it impacts politics, for example. When you ban smoking all over the place because you want to protect citizens' health.
Uh,
Um, okay, yeah, you may agree with that, or you may find fault with it, this, that, and the other. But the point is that at some certain point, it will be the smoker's own fault all the time,
yeah.
and that's where the real witch hunts began.
Yeah.
And
No.
the same thing. I mean, I agree about the scientific approach. On the other hand, a bit of a fly in the ointment. There's so many variables involved that it's actually very, very difficult to maintain. Yeah, you can experiment in magic, but not in the way you can experiment, say, in a chemistry laboratory
Mhm.
or in applied physics, because the variables, let's say the entire mass you're working with, is so heterogeneous that you can't really pinpoint individual elements. If I say try for a chemical reaction, and I use substance A and substance B, and I use that in the ratio of 3 to 1, and it doesn't work out, and then I can repeat it with 2 to 1 and 1 to 1 or 6 to 1 or
Mhm.
whatever. Uh, I may get different results or even the desired results. It's very, very difficult to do that with magic because, yeah, you can say, well, uh, I mean, talking about chaos magic, what chaos magic introduced into modern Western magic was the probabilistic element,
Yes.
saying that the success of a magical act also depends on its probability. So let's
Exactly.
say the probability of you making a comet appear at midnight in the sky, the probability of that happening is 1 to, let's say, 50 trillion. I
Mm.
mean, 50 trillion against, right? So if you do a great magical ritual and so on, and you manage to reduce that probability from 1 to 50 trillion to 1 to 10 trillion,
Oh, yeah.
it's
That's the
it's still
result.
yes, but it's still bloody improbable, right?
Yes.
and,
It still is.
well, that's what probability theory will tell you. It probably won't happen.
Yeah.
So how do you gauge that? I mean, that's basically it's a thought experiment, nothing more. And that is where it turns into a difficult approach to treat magic as you would the materialist sciences, with all the spirit behind it. Do your experiments, and well, if you fail, then acknowledge your failure and analyze what you may have done wrong, what may be improved, and this, that, and the other, as best you can. That, of course, is something you don't find too much in dogmatic, especially in high magic kind of environments, where they will tell you, yeah, even the failure is something you can learn from, so it's really a success, and this, that, and the other. Yeah, you can take that approach. I'm familiar with it, but personally, I don't really condone it.
Hmm. No, I completely agree with you. It's more interesting to analyze and try to figure out and understand everything, and especially the spirit that rules, that moves the ages over time, is always interesting for me to understand. Well, the why is difficult, but at least assess and organize temporally the experience of this zeitgeist that we are living in. Because to some extent, the rules of magic, to call them this, I do believe that they change a little bit depending on geography, the social climate, like in the pandemic, I felt the rules of magic was a bit thwarted now and then. Is things I used to do was a little bit less exact.
I think a lot of people have made that experience, and I'm not ready with some flat explanation for it, but by way of some educated guesses, I'd
Mm.
say that a lot of the issues encountered there are related to a lack of social contact.
Hmm.
A lot of what is called magic depends really on social interaction. Hey, because hey, we're social animals as human beings,
Yes.
two-leggeds. And yes, I know there's quite a few magical schools, systems, if you want to call them that, that will say, yeah, a lot depends on your geography, on your geolocation, to put to put it in
Yeah.
an IT term. The spiritus loci, or uh, the spirits involved, and this, that, and the other. A lot of African and Caribbean magic, and magic derived from that, as I don't have to tell you, in Brazil of all places,
Yeah.
uh, is really very much about that spirit of the place, and then the ancestors, and your lineage, and stuff like that. And yes, but what you have actually pinpointed there is that if you're in isolation, more or less. Oh well, look, like, okay, so we're talking now via Zoom, and it's a good way of communicating. Okay, pre-internet, we would probably never have met, or only in the course of someone touring the world. You coming over to Europe, me coming over to Brazil, possibly, but there's a great chance that we mightn't have met even then. Now that's very simple, but it's not the same thing as meeting eye to eye. It's not the same thing as basically, learning to know someone from the way he walks or she walks, to their facial expression, smell, intonation, this, that, and the other, mimicry, and what have you. And I think when we're isolated, even when you're talking about solitary practice, I mean, even if the magic you do doesn't involve other people actively, that you don't do rituals with others, but you do them at home,
Hmm.
but you're not being able to go out in a meaningful manner, visit your friends, party around, or whatever it is you may do in your free time. Usually, I mean, sans pandemic, uh, that will impact you, of course, and because a lot of the impulses, you won't get a lot of impulses from other people that way, so there's a lack there, and a lot of impulses you project won't be reprojected or mirrored or reacted upon by others. So they're basically, well, whatever, lost in the void, or in ether, or wherever. And that's what I mean by social interaction. It's
Yes.
it's not it's not just about visiting your grandmother, or dancing in a nightclub, or that. Yeah, all that may be, or getting drunk at the bar once a week, or what have you. Um, all that amounts to something, yes, but in general, it's an isolation. Personally, I have no problem with it, because I've been living a more or less isolated life for quite a few years now. uh, I don't like nature too much, so I don't go around a lot.
Yeah.
I prefer staying at home and doing reading, and stuff like that. And okay, I don't live alone. I have my partner with whom I share my flat, and that's fine. But apart from that, my lifestyle hasn't really changed a lot. I don't go partying, and so on. But I do read more than I used to. That's true, but that's not a disadvantage as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
And yes, and I spend time with wonderful people like you, having this interesting conversation, stuff like that. Uh, but yeah, lots of people don't really get along with that very well, and especially if they're younger, if they're not, used to the old ancient hermit's discipline, like we old geezers did, when we would
Yes.
sweep the temple for 30 years before the guru gave us a mantra.
Yeah.
No, but seriously, I mean, it's a different kind of overall environment, and yeah, it tells totally.
Yes. Well, we have an hour. You have a little bit more time, Rolf.
As long as you like.
Yes. Because it's two couple of things here that I think would be very interesting to touch upon. Uh, One is Osmond Spear.
Yep.
How important the totality of Spear's legacy was for you and the IoT? Or was it particularly just the Sigil Magic and Alphabet of Desire that was elected as a sorcerer's tool, amazing to use in the pragmatic context of the IoT?
Well, it's a very complex thing, really, in a way. For one thing, yes, it was a sigil magic, no doubt about it. Second, it was Speer's contrarian, anti-authority, anti-dogmatic viewpoint. I mean,
Mm.
Speer was very much a loner in his magic, and he didn't get along very well with people like Aleister Crowley, for instance. He didn't get along with a lot of authority figures, be it in art or be it in magic. And so the spirit of Speer was certainly quite important. Um, as for his other stuff, and we have to distinguish, and that's why it's so complex, because a lot of what, actually most, except for his own books, most of what we know about Speer, we know via the lens of Kenneth Grant.
Hmm.
And not all of that, in my view, was Speer original. This means, hey, Speer was probably in love with Steffi Grant. He liked her a lot, and the Grants did a hell of a lot for him. They were his sponsors, and he was quite aware of that, and he loved the attention and all that, and Speer, to quite an extent, was actually quite an opportunist as well.
Hmm.
As we say in German, he knew where the bone is hanging.
I,
And every dog who knows where the bone is hanging, guess
yeah,
where
yeah,
they'll go, and what they'll do to get at that bloody bone.
yeah.
And so I'm not at all convinced that everything that is, kind of uh, considered to be Speer's heritage is really original Speer at all. I think there was quite a bit of nudging by Kenneth Grant, who had a very specific way of viewing the world and viewing the magical tradition and so on. And Speer was, I'm not saying Grant made anything up. I have no proof for that. I wouldn't be surprised if he had, but I have no proof for that, and I'm not going to slander his name that way. But I'm quite certain that he did nudge Speer, especially in his later years. He nudged Speer in a direction. All this thing about witchcraft cults and this, that, and the other, that doesn't sound like Speer very much at all.
Mm.
I mean, yeah, he had this Mrs. Patterson thing going, and this, that, and the other. But then, hey, I mean, he invented psychoanalysis, if his tall tales are to be believed, and Freud actually thanked him for it. At least that's what Speer claimed.
Yeah, but
There was never a proof positive of that. But that's one thing I might add. Then leave it to you again.
yeah.
And another important impact of Speer was that he was actually, in my view, the first magician who really invented the psychological magic of a model of magic. He really went for the psychological aspect. He was all Freudian in very many ways. Um, and even though he might claim that Freud copied from him and not the other way around, just like he claimed to have been the first surrealist and stuff like that. That's all to be taken with a huge grain of salt. But yeah, what he did was definitely was implement the psychological model of magic, which even percolated to people like Diane Fortune or William Butler Gray, and so on, and actually became a major influence on Western magic in the 60s, especially in the UK. And so yeah, that's where Speer comes from. Speer's so-called Saskia cultus, that I think was basically a Kenneth Grant invention, more or less, placed upon Speer's shoulders. But yes, the early IoTs had claimed to be a legitimate ear of that Saskia cultus, but most of that was really tongue in cheek.
Yeah, I see. No, Ralph, I completely agree with this psychological the importance of psychology and magic for Speer. And well, I do believe that Speer copied from Freud, but I also do believe that here is the thing: Speer understood Freud better than Freud.
You might argue about that,
Yes,
absolutely, because I mean that's what I've pointed out, that what Speer actually did take Freud's theory of repression and turn it on its head.
exactly.
When Freud said, you might have some trauma which you repress into the subconscious, and then it will cause you to act in strange and neurotic ways, like having to wash your hands every 5 minutes or stuff like that.
Yeah,
That's because there's some unresolved traumas in your subconscious making you do it. And so Speer said, well, if we want to have things happen in the outside world, why don't we suppress them first and let the subconscious make them happen for us?
exactly.
And that was a stroke of genius, absolutely.
I, I I so agree with you, and just this whole thing with embracing the paradox, embracing contradiction, and see that the I is like that. Is I think it's such a more healthy way of looking at the human psyche as well, because you escape the so much of unnecessary pathology of illness implied upon the psyche.
True, and of course, I mean, Speer was in quite a different, you might say, social bracket, and of course, hey, unlike Freud, he wasn't formally a doctor and an academic, and someone who would be pestered by academics all day long from a certain point on, and who had to, his reputation to take into account, and I mean, that's one of the reasons why Freud broke with Jung, for instance, because
Yes,
one of the reasons was basically that Freud thought that Jung was being unscientific about matters.
yes,
Uh, Maybe he was right, maybe he wasn't, and Jung himself was anything but an angel. But that's another story. But there were different factors to consider for Freud, apart from the fact that I'm personally quite convinced that Freud was never aware of Orson Osman Speer at any time in his life. But the reverse certainly does hold true.
hmm
Vidi Speer's claim that Freud actually wrote to him, though these letters have never ever surfaced, and there's absolutely no proof for that except Speer claiming so. And after I don't know how many pints of real ale.
yeah. Okay, so those would be letters I would like to see, but okay, yes. Who knows, digging out there in the archives of whatever, things
in
are
the Akasha,
surfacing.
in the Akasha, maybe. Yeah.
In the Akasha, yeah, yeah, of course. We have always Akashic records. So, and Ralph, one other thing I think would be interesting to touch upon in the end here is for yourself, your inspirations, in terms of art, magic, music, life, philosophy, where you find your inspirations.
Well, in a nutshell, I can say the only thing I'm really interested in is problems.
Mm.
And I have my problems with what I call conventional magic, and that resulted, among other things, in my developing what I term ice magic, which is a totally different topic in its own. But what I'm really interested in is human powerlessness.
Mhm.
And I think that magic is actually at least an attempt at countering that or reducing it or even abolishing it. Now, and that is basically what my life is about in a nutshell, really. I
Mm.
mean, I can tell you a lot of personal stuff, but I like cooking, for instance, or I smoke pipes or cigar or stuff like that. But hey, that's really of no real interest, and that's why in my social media uh, accounts I really keep personal information to a minimum because, frankly, I don't think I'm that important for everyone else to know what I've had for dinner.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm not really too interested in what other people have had for dinner either. So, so, but yes, I do try to, as I said, I've just written another book. It has been published in German already, but it will be out with Llewellyn's hopefully soon. Was supposed to be out in October, but then there was Corona and stuff.
Ah,
And that is actually a part of an answer to your question, because that's a book written by myself and three other people who were members of the 70s and 80s German or Bonn group of magicians, which was a work group for experimental magic we had, and so the four of us were members of that group, and we're not just this isn't just historical tales from the trenches, as it were.
yeah.
There's a bit of that as well, but the main part is actually of what we think magic is about today. And there's four entirely different and varying and even contradictory views of it. And so that's why in German, the book is actually, if you translate the German title, Magie heute, it translates into Magic Today,
Okay.
reports from praxis.
Uh-huh.
The English title will be Living Magic, which is a fair translation, I think.
Mhm.
And of course, it has this thing about either the magic as it is living, and magic as you live it. And so I think it was a rather good idea of my American publishers. But that apart, I'm really very much into investigating magic as doing the impossible.
Yeah. The impossible in life or in the visible or in the invisible or all realms?
All realms, and I'm not trying to be funny when I say that if anything, if I had, as you have that in social media a lot, where you have to name your name and your gender and your age and your confession and whatever.
Ugh.
If I answer those by way of confession, I'd say I'm an agnostic Gnostic.
Oh, okay.
I have a lot of sympathy for historical Gnosticism,
Yes.
and I've analyzed it in quite in depth, and I'm actually writing another book about it. Well, about applied Gnosticism, let's put it this way, or experiential gnosis. But I'm also agnostic in the sense that I don't believe that we can ever fathom it all out. We're
Yeah.
simply incapable of doing that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. But
Exactly.
returning to your initial question about how about being critical and of things and questioning them, that's the whole point. Once you realize that you're actually limited in your cognition and the way you can actually process whatever you observe in the world and experience, once you realize how limited you are, uh,
Yes.
the question arises of what you do about it and with it. And simply going for more and more and more optimization won't work because there's limits to it. We're finite beings.
Exactly.
So it's not about doing more than you can. It's about never doing, or trying to at least, never doing less than you can.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's the same for me. The more wise one is supposed to be as time goes, the bigger the landscape ahead. You know, it's
Absolutely, yeah, yeah.
always feel like
And
so big intellectual or achievements or wisdom, but my God, it just made the landscape even bigger.
you know, I was raised in a bilingual, or actually multilingual environment,
Hmm.
and that's why English is more or less my second language. I've been speaking English for 60 years now, but I'm not being facetious when I tell you that I'm still learning English.
Hmm. Of course.
Personally, I think the English is really an unlearnable language. Um, and I've learned some other languages as well. As you know, well, not very active my Portuguese, but I read it fairly fluently, and French and Latin and so on. German, of course, but there's not a day passes when I'm not learning something new about English. And I'm mentioning this not because English is so interesting here in this context, but it's the same about the world, and it's the same about magic. Uh, if you ever feel that you're finished, there's no more thing, nothing more to learn.
Yes.
That should really raise all red flags you still have around you. Probably not too many, or you wouldn't have thought that in the first place. But and if you're lucky, life will teach you otherwise. If you're unlucky, you will do it the hard way.
Yes. Oh, I agree, and it's for me, this is truly the great legacy of that you and the IoT or this impulse of chaos magic gave to the world is its refusal to be stagnant, this anti-authoritarian take upon uh, where there is dogma. Let's crush it together to see if it stands truth or the ground or the doubt that we are presenting to it, and um, to always keep the mind open, the flexibility of the mind, always questioning is in this way, magic and life just ties into one another, and we become magic and we live magic, as I see
Well, yes, and that's one of the reasons why I'm still at it, because it
it.
never stops. And I mean, okay, there's other disciplines which may never stop either. Like, say, if you really dig into alchemy, for instance, or astrology for that matter, which I happen had to have studied to some great extent and written 2 books about it. But they never stop either. But magic encompasses a whole lot more. Astrology is very much life related if you do it properly, as I think you should. But and there's a hell of a lot more to learn about it every day, every minute you devote to it. But magic is really about actually working your life like an engineer, making things happen, on preventing things from happening, and this, that, and the other. And that astrology doesn't give you that. Astrology gives you a lot of analysis tools, and they can be great if used properly. But and that is a value in its own.
Mhm.
Alchemy may be a different story again, because that's very much about learning about matter and non-manifest matter and this, that, and the other. I have a high respect for everyone who goes for it. Uh, and but well, for me, magic was this thing, this never-ending source of amazement, and it's actually still is.
Yes, no, I agree, and it's so much, and when you see how William Burroughs, Timothy Leary, these people that were so occupied with thinking outside the box to understand the visible and invisible, the limits, the limitlessness, and everything is. Uh, I do believe that these forces are still present in this pragmatic mindset of this approach towards magic and life together.
Actually, they're not really that novel. When you look at Greek antiquity, for instance, you had the doc philosophers,
Hmm.
right? The Cynics.
Ah, yes, yes.
That's where
Diogenes.
cynicism
Yes.
comes from. Kynos, right?
Yes.
The dog, and they were anti-academy.
Yeah.
They were
True.
anti-establishment. They'd lie around in the street, fornicating in the street, eating shit, insulting people, being all punk, you might
Yes.
say,
Yeah.
as punk used to be once, or
Yes.
claimed to be once at least, and or in India, for example, in Indian culture, you have the Aghoris,
Hmm.
who don't give shit about religious dogma either,
True
and
that.
who will do all things that are taboo and forbidden and frowned upon by Hindu orthodoxy, and this, that, and the other. And to some extent, you have that within Sufism. To some extent, you have that within Buddhism.
Yes.
So Taoism, even. I think a lot of Taoism explains itself as a kind of revolution against Confucius.
Yes. True.
but okay, in a very Chinese way, and I'm not familiar enough with Chinese or Chinese culture to be able to judge it in a meaningful manner, but that's at least my informed impression. And so you will always find that. And hey, if you look at legends and fairy tales and so on, usually the magician or the witch or the sorcerer or whatever is an isolated person, is someone, he lives in the forest, far away from other human settlements.
Yes.
As the shaman, yeah, they'll be integrated into their respective societies if there is considered to be, the tribe's memory, the tribe's library, the tribe's healer, of course, and sorcerer or whatever. But then they were also, people you would better stay off. You wouldn't really become friends with them because they could be considered to be dangerous or alien in some ways. And that again is a reflection on how alienating magic can, and in my view actually should be.
Mm.
That's why I relate to the Gnostics view of the world,
Yes. Yeah.
or to take Kerouac, who certainly wasn't a Gnostic, but certainly a spiritual Buddhist in his manner, when he said that all life is a foreign country.
Hmm.
And if you have that in you, not everybody does, but if you have that in you, feeling alien in this world, uh, then hey, there's nothing else but to take up that these arms against the sea of trouble, as the Bard says, and by opposing Anthem.
Yes. No, yeah.
So that
Complete.
may be impossible, and you're doomed to failure. So what?
Exactly. So no, it's so I see the spirit of the beatniks is still a great spirit to
Totally,
continue today. Absolutely.
totally, totally.
So do you consider yourself a modern beatnik?
Well, yeah, or a late hippie, whatever. I mean, I
Yeah.
still have my, I, st- I
A
still don't
Gnostic beatnik?
shave, and yes, an agnostic, Gnostic beatnik. Yeah.
Yes.
I still wear long hair, and if you'd see me in the road or something, you might say, "Well, yeah, that's a '60s generation, sure."
Okay.
I never abandoned that, even though I don't do drugs anymore. But that's more for loss of interest rather than anything else.
I see. Yeah. Okay. As the time change, life change, interest change.
Yeah,
So
sure,
yeah.
sure, sure. And reefers change.
Yes. I see. Well, Ralph, I think that's a good finishing for our talk. And what a great pleasure to speak with you. And who knows, maybe we can repeat this sometime in the future.
Anytime, and thanks for having me, and thanks for a very intelligent conversation. I don't say that easily. I'm supposed to be pretty critical on that score, and I very much enjoyed it. And yes, I'd be amenable to following up whenever it suits you.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
And best regards to all my Brazilian visitors or listeners or viewers. There's a lot of stuff going on in Brazil I'm becoming more and more aware of, though I can't participate in it for various reasons. But yeah, it's some interesting culture you've going over there.
Yeah, it's quite hectic, diverse,
Hmm.
for good and for bad as always. When there is too much in the pot.
Yeah, it has its upsides and its downsides, like every culture. But I think it's something that merits being known more about in the rest of the world, frankly.
Yes, I think the only thing in Brazil here that is a bit upsetting or a bit why is Brazilians have this tendency of looking outwards to the West, to America, and is everything better outside?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
for me, it's very different. So 20 years living here now, and I came here, and I'm still here,
yeah.
exploring, investigating
And there's reasons for that.
yes,
Yes.
you see, because it's such a rich and vibrant and tangible spiritual traditions here. It's wonderful. So, but I'm seeing this is changing slowly. That people are getting a bit more interested in their own roots in what is going on in the spiritual part of the Amazon, in the roots of this and that, and these traditions we have here, because they are getting watered down and a bit more invisible, hard to access, fused with more modern popular elements, because again, this thing that people think that what we have is less good than what is out, try to make things more exotic, put more gravy on the meat, and
Hmm.
you see, it's
Well, you see that in a lot in post-colonial cultures anyway. I mean, I grew up in post-colonial countries, and it was basically the same thing there. They had some very strong local traditions, but
hmm,
there was always this overlay of their previous colonial overlords, and they were independent, yes, but not really, because I mean, financially, economically, politically, they were anything but. They were trying to become so, and so on. So it was always a great mix of staring outside to foreign cultures, hypnotized by the predominance on the one hand, and trying to revive or to appreciate their indigenous, their local stuff, which of course they had hundreds of years of it being trashed by the colonial overlords. And it was the same thing with Brazil, even though Brazil became independent fairly early on.
hmm.
But, it reminds me of that quote of the Chinese politician Zhou Enlai in the mid-50s, when they asked him what was the impact of the French Revolution on world history. And in 1965 or something, he said, "It's too early yet to say." And a very, very Chinese way of looking at things,
Yes.
and I think the same may hold good for Brazil. It will probably take another few generations until you might get rid of this sort of hypnotic stare
Yes.
towards other foreign cultures. But then, of course, there's also this human tendency that the grass tends to be greener on the other side of the fence all the time, right?
Exactly. All of these things, But
Yeah,
let's see how it's changing our heads. It's still too early to say how it will change.
yeah, yeah. I think so. Yeah.
So, Ralph,
Okay. Thanks for
truly,
having me again, and have a nice day. Have a nice
you
time.
too. Truly a
Yeah,
pleasure. Okay.
same here. Obrigado e até logo.